The dust kicked up by the approaching wagon train painted the Arizona sky a rusty orange as the sun began its descent behind the jagged peaks surrounding Red Ridge. Aiyana Mitchell stood on the wooden sidewalk outside Hartley's general store, her calloused hands gripping the package of medicine for Mrs. Patterson's newborn. The townspeople gave her the usual wide berth, close enough to acknowledge the preacher's adopted daughter, far enough to remind her she didn't truly belong. "Well, I'll be damned," muttered Tom Brennan, the town's blacksmith, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "That there's Baron von Steinberg's outfit. Heard he's bringing some fancy German machinery for that new silver mine up in Devil's Canyon." Aiyana's dark eyes followed the impressive convoy. 6 heavy wagons loaded with strange mechanical contraptions she'd never seen, accompanied by a dozen outriders and what appeared to be a portable corral on wheels. But it was the sound that made her heart skip, the wild, desperate neighing of a horse in distress. The lead wagon stopped directly in front of the Red Ridge Saloon, and a tall, distinguished man in his 50s stepped down. His perfectly tailored suit and polished boots marked him as city folk, but his weathered hands and confident bearing suggested he was no stranger to hard work. Baron von Steinberg removed his hat, revealing graying temples and sharp blue eyes that took in everything around him with calculated interest. "Mein Gott, what a journey," he said in accented English, addressing the growing crowd. "I trust we can find adequate accommodations in your fine town." Mayor Hutchins, a portly man who rarely moved faster than necessary, hurried forward with uncharacteristic speed. "Baron, welcome to Red Ridge. We've prepared rooms at the hotel, and I'm sure everyone's mighty curious about your mining operation." But Aiyana wasn't listening to their exchange. The desperate whinnying continued, and through a gap in the crowd, she caught sight of the source. In the wheeled corral, a magnificent black stallion threw himself against the wooden bars with such force that the entire structure shook. His coat gleamed like polished obsidian, and his eyes held a wildness that reminded her of something deep within herself, something she'd tried to forget. "That Mustang's been nothing but trouble since we caught him up near Flagstaff," grumbled one of the Baron's men, a grizzled cowboy with rope burns on his forearms. "Near killed 2 of our best wranglers. Baron insisted on bringing him, though. Says he wants to see if any of you local boys can break him." Jake Morrison pushed through the crowd, his reputation preceding him like his shadow. At 28, he was considered the finest horsebreaker in the territory, a man who could gentle any horse given enough time and patience. His sandy hair was perpetually dusty, and his green eyes held the quiet confidence of someone who'd never met an animal he couldn't handle. "How long you been trying to break him?" Jake asked, studying the stallion with professional interest. 3 weeks, the cowboy replied. "Ain't even been able to get a saddle on him. Baron says he'll pay $50 to any man who can ride him for 10 seconds. A chorus of whistles and excited murmurs rippled through the crowd. $50 was more than most cowboys made in 3 months. "That Mustang can't be tamed," laughed Charlie Oakes, a young ranch hand with more confidence than skill. "Look at them wild eyes. He's got devil in him, sure enough." "Ain't no horse can't be broken with the right approach," Jake said quietly, but his eyes remained fixed on the stallion. There was something about the animal's movements, the way it held its head, that spoke of intelligence beyond mere wildness. Aiyana found herself stepping closer, drawn by an instinct she couldn't name. The stallion's head turned toward her, and for a moment, their eyes met. In that instant, she saw not madness but a desperate cry for freedom, the same cry that echoed in her own heart every time someone called her the preacher's Indian girl, or crossed the street to avoid her. "Sarah, there you are!" The sharp voice of her adoptive mother cut through her reverie. Sarah Mitchell hurried toward her, bonnet slightly askew and worry lines creasing her kind face. "I've been looking everywhere. Mrs. Patterson needs that medicine, and your father wants you home before dark." "Yes, ma'am," Aiyana replied, tearing her gaze away from the stallion. But as she turned to leave, she heard the Baron's voice rise above the crowd. "Interesting," he said, his accent thick with contemplation. "The horse responds to her. Tell me, young lady, do you have experience with horses?" All eyes turned to Aiyana, and she felt the familiar flush of unwanted attention. "Some, sir. I help with the horses at the livery stable." The Baron's eyes sparkled with something that looked almost like recognition. "Fascinating. Perhaps we shall speak again soon." He turned back to the crowd. "Gentlemen, the challenge stands. $50 to any man who can ride thunder for 10 seconds. We shall see what your frontier can accomplish that 3 weeks of German efficiency could not." As Aiyana hurried home with Sarah, the stallion's cries followed them down Main Street, each desperate whinny pulling at something deep in her chest. She didn't know it yet, but Thunder, as the Baron had named him, would change everything she thought she knew about herself, her place in the world, and the thin line between civilization and the wild freedom of her Apache blood. The Mitchell household sat in uneasy silence as Reverend Joshua Mitchell finished his evening prayer. The oil lamp cast dancing shadows across the modest kitchen where Aiyana sat picking at her plate of beans and cornbread. Through the thin walls, Thunder's intermittent cries carried on the desert wind, each sound making her shoulders tense. "That poor creature," Sarah murmured, her gentle heart always moved by suffering. "It's been hours since they penned him up. Perhaps someone should—" "Sarah." Joshua's voice carried the quiet authority that commanded respect from his congregation. At 52, the preacher bore the weathered look of a man who'd spent 15 years ministering to frontier souls. His grey beard was neatly trimmed, but his hands showed the calluses of someone who practiced what he preached about honest work. "The Baron's business is his own. We've provided you a Christian home, Aiyana, but that doesn't mean we meddle in every affair that comes to town." Aiyana set down her fork, the metal clinking against the tin plate. "Father, I could take him some water. The trip from Flagstaff in this heat—" "Absolutely not." Joshua's tone brooked no argument. "You'll not go near that animal. I've seen what wild horses can do, and I'll not lose the daughter God saw fit to place in our care." The word daughter always carried a slight hesitation when Joshua said it, though Aiyana knew he meant well. She'd been 8 years old when Captain Morrison's cavalry unit found her during the aftermath of a raid on an Apache camp near the Mogollon Rim. Her parents, her real parents, lay dead alongside 24 others, victims of what the newspaper called justified retaliation for recent attacks on settlers. She remembered fragments, her mother's voice singing traditional songs, her father teaching her to read horse tracks in the sand, the way her grandmother's weathered hands had braided feathers into her hair. But 12 years with the Mitchells had layered Christian hymns and English lessons over those memories until they felt like dreams from someone else's life. "The Baron seems like a reasonable man," Sarah offered, clearly trying to steer the conversation to safer ground. "Mr. Hutchins says he's promised steady work for anyone willing to learn his mining methods." "Progress comes at a cost," Joshua replied, reaching for his well-worn Bible. "I pray his intentions align with God's plan for our community." Thunder's cry pierced the night again, raw and desperate. Aiyana excused herself and stepped onto the small porch, needing air. The stars blazed overhead with a brilliance that city folk never witnessed, and she found herself remembering nights when her Apache grandmother had pointed out constellations with different names, told different stories. "Can't sleep either," the voice startled her. Jake Morrison emerged from the shadows beside their fence, his hat in his hands and his sandy hair tousled. Up close, she could see the concern in his green eyes. "Mr. Morrison," she said formally, though they'd known each other peripherally for years. "What brings you by?" "Been studying that stallion," he admitted, settling his weight against the fence post. "There's something different about him. Most horses fight because they're scared or angry. This one fights like he's protecting something." Aiyana felt her pulse quicken. "What do you mean?" "Can't rightly say, but I've broke horses for 10 years, and I never seen one with eyes like that. It's like he's trying to tell us something." Jake paused, studying her face in the starlight. "You felt it too, didn't you? This afternoon, when you looked at him." She wanted to deny it, to maintain the careful distance she'd cultivated between herself and anything that reminded the town of her heritage. But something in Jake's voice, genuine curiosity rather than judgment, made her nod. "My grandmother used to say horses carry the memories of their ancestors," she said softly. "That wild horses remember when the world was bigger, before fences and towns." "Your Apache grandmother?" The question hung between them. Most folks in Red Ridge knew Aiyana's story, but they rarely spoke of it directly. It was easier to pretend she'd always been the preacher's daughter, always been civilized. "Yes," she said simply. Jake was quiet for a long moment, watching the distant glow from the saloon, where men were undoubtedly discussing their plans to collect the Baron's $50 prize. "My pa always said the Apache were the finest horsemen he ever saw. Said they could read an animal's spirit like other folks read books." "Your father knew Apache?" "Before the Indian Wars got bad, he traded with them sometimes. Said they had ways with horses that white men never learned." Jake turned to face her directly. "Aiyana, that stallion's been fighting for 3 weeks. Every man who's tried to break him has used force, ropes, whips, force. But what if that's not what he needs?" "I don't understand." What if he needs someone who speaks his language? The implication hit her like a physical blow. Mr. Morrison, I appreciate your interest, but I'm not Apache anymore. I haven't been for 12 years. I go to church, I read scripture, I help Sarah with the church social. I'm nothing like... Like what? His voice was gentle but insistent. Like what people think I am. Thunder's cry echoed again, and this time Aiyana couldn't suppress the shiver that ran through her. In that sound, she heard something that called to a part of herself she'd buried beneath layers of Christian propriety and desperate acceptance. Maybe, Jake said quietly, you don't have to choose between what you were and what you've become. Maybe you can be both. Before she could respond, Sarah's voice called from inside. Aiyana, is everything all right? Yes, ma'am, she called back, then turned to Jake. I should go inside. He nodded, settling his hat back on his head. Tomorrow morning, the Baron's offering that $50 to anyone brave enough to try. Half the men in town will be there making a show of it. He paused at the gate. But if you wanted to see Thunder up close, real early before the crowds gather, well, I reckon the Baron might appreciate someone who actually understands horses instead of just pretending to. As Jake's footsteps faded into the night, Aiyana remained on the porch, torn between the safety of her carefully constructed life and the wild call of something she'd thought was lost forever. Above her, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the boundaries humans drew between civilization and wilderness, between who they were and who they were meant to be. Dawn painted Redridge in shades of gold and amber as Aiyana slipped from the Mitchell house, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd barely slept, Jake's words echoing in her mind alongside Thunder's distant cries. The town lay silent, except for the occasional rooster's crow and the soft whisper of wind through the mesquite bushes. The makeshift corral had been moved behind the Redridge Hotel, away from the main street, but close enough that the gathered crowd could witness today's spectacle. As Aiyana approached, she could see Thunder pacing the confines of his wooden prison, his magnificent black coat rippling with each restless movement. Even from a distance, his agitation was palpable. You're early. Baron von Steinberg's voice carried only mild surprise as he emerged from behind the hotel, carrying a steaming cup of coffee. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of a sleepless night. His shirt was wrinkled, his normally perfect hair disheveled. I wanted to see him, Aiyana said, surprised by her own boldness. Before the others come. The Baron studied her with those sharp blue eyes, and she had the uncomfortable feeling he was seeing far more than she intended to reveal. Yeah, I thought you might. There is something about you and Thunder that interests me greatly. Thunder? That is what I have named him. In German we say Donner, but your English Thunder suits him better, I think. He is like the storm, powerful, wild, impossible to contain. The Baron sipped his coffee thoughtfully. Tell me, Miss Mitchell, what do you see when you look at him? Aiyana approached the corral slowly, her bare feet silent on the packed earth. She'd deliberately chosen her oldest dress, one that Sarah constantly threatened to use for rags, and had left her bonnet at home. Something told her that Thunder wouldn't respond to the trappings of civilization. I see. She paused, watching the stallion's movements. There was a pattern to his pacing, she realized. Not random panic, but something almost ritualistic. I see someone who remembers when the world had no fences. Ach, ja, exactly so. The Baron's voice held approval. My men, they see only an animal to be broken, but you see the spirit, nicht wahr? Thunder had stopped pacing and was now watching them intently. His ears swiveled forward, and Aiyana could swear she saw intelligence in those dark eyes. Not the dull acceptance of a domesticated horse, but the sharp awareness of a creature that had never surrendered its wild nature. May I... Aiyana hesitated, then forged ahead. May I try something? The Baron raised an eyebrow. The challenge does not begin for 2 hours, and it is only for men who... I don't want your $50, Aiyana interrupted, then flushed at her rudeness. I apologize. I think he's trying to tell us something. For a long moment, the Baron studied her. Then, to her surprise, he smiled. In my country, we have legends of horse whisperers, people who could speak to the spirits of wild things. I have never seen such a person, but... He gestured toward the corral. Proceed, Miss Mitchell. Let us see what Thunder has to say. Aiyana's hands trembled slightly as she approached the wooden rails. Thunder watched her every movement, his body tense and ready to flee or fight. But something in his posture suggested curiosity rather than aggression. She stopped just out of reach and did something that felt both foreign and utterly natural. She began to hum. It was a melody her grandmother had sung, one of the few Apache songs she remembered clearly. The notes rose and fell like wind through canyon walls, wordless but rich with meaning she couldn't have explained in English. Thunder's ears pricked forward, and his restless movement stilled. For the first time since his capture, he stood completely motionless, head cocked as if listening to something he'd almost forgotten. "Remarkable," the Baron whispered, but Aiyana barely heard him. Slowly, maintaining eye contact with Thunder, she began to sing softly in Apache. The words came haltingly at first. She was rusty from disuse, but grew stronger as muscle memory overtook conscious thought. It was a song about the bond between horse and rider, about partnership rather than dominance, about the sacred trust between two spirits choosing to run together rather than one conquering the other. Thunder took a step closer to the rail, then another. His nostrils flared, taking in her scent, and something in his eyes shifted from wariness to recognition, not of her personally, but of something deeper, something that spoke to his wild heart in a language older than fences and towns. "I'll be damned." Jake Morrison's voice broke the spell. Aiyana spun around, her cheeks burning with embarrassment at being caught in such an intimate moment. Jake stood about 20 feet away, his hat in his hands, and wonder written across his face. "How long have you been watching?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Long enough to see something I never thought I'd witness," he replied, moving closer with the careful steps of someone approaching something precious and fragile. "Aiyana, he was coming to you. I saw it. For just a moment there, he wasn't a captive animal. He was choosing to approach." The Baron nodded enthusiastically. "This is exactly what I hoped to see. Miss Mitchell, you have a gift that my finest horse trainers lack. You speak to something in Thunder that force cannot touch." "But I don't—" Aiyana struggled with the implications. Accepting this gift meant accepting the Apache part of herself that she'd spent 12 years trying to suppress. It meant acknowledging that there were parts of her identity that Christian charity and civilized education couldn't replace or improve upon. "You're exactly who you are," the Baron said gently, "and who you are may be exactly what Thunder needs." He paused, glancing toward town, where the first early risers were beginning to stir. "The challenge still stands, but I find myself hoping that before these cowboys try their ropes and spurs, Thunder might have the chance to choose his own path." The sound of approaching voices and boot heels on wooden sidewalks announced the arrival of the spectators. Within minutes, they'd be surrounded by curious townspeople eager to see Thunder broken and tamed. But in this quiet moment before the chaos, Aiyana felt something she hadn't experienced in 12 years. The recognition of her true self, reflected in the wild eyes of a creature who, like her, carried the memories of a freer world in his heart. Thunder nickered softly, a sound almost like a question, and Aiyana found herself answering in Apache without conscious thought. Whatever happened next, she could no longer pretend that part of herself didn't exist. By mid-morning, half of Red Ridge had gathered behind the hotel to witness the Baron's challenge. Men in dusty work clothes mingled with curious shopkeepers and their wives, all eager to see who would claim the $50 prize. The air buzzed with excitement, and the smell of tobacco smoke as bets were placed and boasts were made. Thunder had retreated to the far corner of his corral, his earlier calm shattered by the growing crowd. His eyes rolled white with stress, and he struck the ground repeatedly with his front hooves, warning anyone who came too close. "Look at him now," sneered Charlie Oakes, the young cowboy who'd mocked Thunder the day before. "All that talk about devil horses, but he's just scared. Give me 10 minutes with a good rope, and I'll have him eating out of my hand." Jake Morrison stood apart from the boastful cowboys, his experienced eye taking in Thunder's defensive posture. "Charlie, that horse has been pushed to his limit. You go in there swinging a rope, and somebody's going to get hurt." "You scared, Morrison?" Charlie's voice carried a challenge that made several men turn to listen. "Thought you were supposed to be the best horsebreaker in the territory." "Being the best means knowing when not to push," Jake replied evenly. "That stallion's been traumatized enough." Mayor Hutchins climbed onto a wooden crate, his portly frame wobbling as he addressed the crowd. "Gentlemen, ladies, the Baron has generously offered $50 to any man who can stay mounted on that Mustang for 10 seconds, who will be first to try their luck." "I will." Charlie stepped forward, already uncoiling his lariat. "Time to show this Apache pony what American cowboys can do." The casual slur made Aiyana's stomach clench. She stood with Sarah near the back of the crowd, trying to remain invisible while her heart hammered with growing dread. Charlie's crude confidence reminded her of every cruel comment she'd endured, every reminder that she would never be truly accepted. Baron von Steinberg raised his hand. "One moment, please. I have a condition that was not mentioned yesterday. Anyone attempting this challenge must first demonstrate they can enter the corral safely. If you cannot approach Thunder without violence, you have already failed." Charlie's swagger faltered slightly. "What do you mean, violence? No ropes, no whips, no weapons of any kind. If you must use force to even get near Thunder, how can you hope to ride him?" The Baron's logic was unassailable, and murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Charlie approached the corral gate with his rope coiled and ready. The moment he lifted the latch, Thunder exploded into motion. The stallion reared to his full height, his hooves striking the air just inches from Charlie's face. With a curse, the young cowboy stumbled backward, his bravado evaporating. "He's loco!" Charlie protested. "Ain't no way to get near him without a rope." 3 more men tried, each with the same result. Thunder's fear and rage had built to a crescendo, and he met every approach with teeth bared and hooves flying. The crowd's excitement began to turn to frustration, and several people started talking about leaving. "This is impossible," muttered Doc Harrison, the town physician. "That animal's been pushed past reason. Someone's going to get killed if this continues." Aiyana watched Thunder's desperate defense with growing anguish. Each failed attempt drove him deeper into panic, further from the calm connection they'd shared at dawn. She could see him retreating into pure survival instinct, losing the intelligence and spirit that made him magnificent. "Enough," Jake Morrison said suddenly, his voice cutting through the crowd's chatter. "Baron, with respect, this isn't working. That horse is terrified out of his mind. Maybe it's time to—" "Wait." The Baron's eyes had found Aiyana across the crowd. "Miss Mitchell, you spoke with Thunder this morning. What is your assessment of his current state?" All eyes turned to Aiyana, and she felt the familiar flush of unwanted attention. But this time, something was different. This time she looked at Thunder, really looked at him, and saw past her own fear to his desperate need. "He's not angry," she said, her voice carrying farther than she intended. "He's protecting himself. Every person who's approached him has brought violence. He's learned to expect it." "Protecting himself from what?" Mayor Hutchins asked, his tone suggesting he thought her observation irrelevant. "From being broken," Aiyana replied, the words coming from someplace deeper than conscious thought. "From losing the last part of himself that remembers being free." An uncomfortable silence settled over the crowd. Several men shifted their weight, and she caught whispered comments about Indian nonsense and getting above herself. But the Baron stepped forward, his eyes bright with interest. "And how would you approach such a creature, Miss Mitchell?" "Hypothetically, of course." Aiyana's mouth went dry. She was aware of Sarah's hand on her arm, of Jake Morrison's encouraging nod, of the skeptical faces surrounding her. But mostly she was aware of Thunder, still trembling in the corner of his prison, waiting for the next assault on his dignity. "I would ask his permission," she said simply. Charlie Oakes laughed harshly. "Ask his permission? Lady, it's a horse, not a person. You can't reason with a dumb animal." "Thunder isn't dumb," Aiyana replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "He's been trying to tell us something all along, but nobody's been listening." "This is ridiculous," scoffed Tom Brennan. "Baron, you're entertaining the fantasies of a what, exactly?" The Baron's voice carried a dangerous quiet that silenced the blacksmith mid-sentence. "Please continue your thought, Mr. Brennan." Tom's face reddened, but he said nothing more. The Baron's protection was unexpected, and it gave Aiyana a courage she hadn't known she possessed. "If someone wanted to try a different approach," she said carefully, "they might start by showing Thunder that not everyone means him harm. They might speak to him in a language he understands. They might offer partnership instead of domination." "And you believe you could do this?" the Baron asked. The question hung in the air like smoke from a campfire. Aiyana knew that her answer would change everything. Her relationship with the town, with the Mitchells, with herself. She looked at Thunder one more time and saw something that broke her heart. He had stopped fighting. He stood in the corner, head down, spirit dimming with each passing moment of human cruelty. "Yes," she said, "I believe I could." The crowd erupted in surprised chatter, but the Baron raised his hand for silence. "Then, Miss Mitchell, would you be willing to try? Not for the $50, but to show us all what Thunder has been trying to tell us?" Sarah's grip tightened on Aiyana's arm. "Aiyana, dear, perhaps she should follow her heart," Jake Morrison interrupted, his green eyes locked on Aiyana's face. "If anyone can reach that horse, it's her." Aiyana looked around the circle of faces, some skeptical, some curious, some openly hostile. But it was Thunder's defeated posture that made her decision. He deserved better than to have his spirit crushed by fear and misunderstanding. "I'll try," she said, and felt something inside herself unfurl like a flower finally allowed to bloom in sunlight. The crowd fell silent as Aiyana approached the corral gate. Thunder lifted his head, nostrils flaring, but something in his posture suggested recognition rather than fear. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her back, hear the whispered comments and barely suppressed skepticism, but her focus narrowed to the magnificent creature before her. "Take your time, Miss Mitchell," the Baron said softly. "There is no hurry." Aiyana nodded, her hands steady as she lifted the gate latch. Unlike the cowboys before her, she made no sudden movements, carried no equipment. She wore only her faded calico dress and the growing confidence that came from finally accepting who she truly was. Thunder watched her enter, his ears forward with cautious interest. She stopped just inside the gate and sat down cross-legged in the dust, making herself small and non-threatening. The unexpected action drew murmurs from the crowd, but she ignored them. "She Aiyana Yinishe," she said softly in Apache, introducing herself with words she hadn't spoken in 12 years. "I am called Aiyana." Thunder's ears swiveled toward her voice, and he took a tentative step closer. Aiyana began to hum the same melody she'd used that morning, letting the ancient song fill the space between them with something beyond human language, a communication of spirit to spirit. "What's she doing?" Charlie Oakes whispered loudly. "Just sitting there like some kind of medicine woman." "She's listening," Jake Morrison replied, his voice carrying a respect that surprised even him. "Something the rest of us forgot how to do." Thunder approached slowly, drawn by the familiar song and the absence of threat. When he was close enough to touch, Aiyana extended her hand palm up, offering her scent for his inspection. The stallion's soft muzzle brushed her fingers, and she felt the warmth of his breath against her skin. "Diin god ya ate," she whispered, a blessing her grandmother had taught her for moments of sacred connection. Thunder's eyes met hers, and in that gaze she saw not the wild terror of a trapped animal, but the ancient wisdom of a creature who had never forgotten his true nature. Slowly, Aiyana rose to her feet. Thunder didn't retreat. Instead, he followed her movements with curious attention as she began to move around him in a gentle circle, her voice rising and falling in traditional Apache horse songs. Each step was a conversation, each note a bridge between two worlds that had been taught to see each other as enemies. "Remarkable," the Baron breathed. "She moves with him, not against him." The transformation in Thunder was visible to everyone watching. His tense muscles relaxed, his breathing deepened, and for the first time since his capture, he lowered his guard. When Aiyana placed her hand on his neck, he leaned into her touch rather than pulling away. "She ain't even trying to break him," observed Doc Harrison, wonder creeping into his voice. "She's asking him to trust her." "That's impossible," Tom Brennan muttered. "Horses don't understand words." "Maybe not English words," Jake said quietly, "but there's more than one way to communicate." Aiyana continued her patient approach, each gesture building on the last. She ran her hands along Thunder's neck and shoulders, speaking to him in a mixture of Apache and soft English words, telling him about the desert winds and the mountain peaks, about the freedom that lived in his blood and always would. Then, in a moment that left the entire crowd speechless, Thunder lowered his magnificent head and rested his forehead against Aiyana's chest, a gesture of complete trust that no amount of force could have achieved. "My God," Sarah Mitchell whispered, tears streaming down her face. "She's not breaking him at all, she's honoring him." When Aiyana finally placed her hand on Thunder's back, he stood perfectly still, not the rigid stillness of defeat, but the calm stillness of a creature who had chosen to share his strength with someone he trusted. She swung herself up onto his back with the fluid grace of someone born to ride, and Thunder's only response was a soft whicker of contentment. They stood together in the center of the corral, woman and horse united in perfect harmony. There was no struggle, no battle of wills, no conquest. Instead, there was something far more powerful, mutual respect between two spirits who recognized each other as equals. 10 seconds, the Baron called out, though his voice suggested the arbitrary time limit had become meaningless. 20, 30, but Aiyana wasn't counting seconds. She was experiencing something she'd thought lost forever, the feeling of complete belonging, of being exactly who she was meant to be. Thunder's strength flowed beneath her, not subdued, but willingly shared, and in that sharing, she found the missing piece of her own soul. When she finally slipped down from Thunder's back, the stallion nuzzled her shoulder affectionately. The gesture was so gentle, so full of genuine connection, that several women in the crowd began to cry. "Well, I'll be damned," Charlie Oakes said, his voice stripped of all bravado. "She really did it." Baron von Steinberg approached the corral with tears in his own eyes. "Miss Mitchell, that was extraordinary, but I think you have misunderstood the nature of my gift." Aiyana looked up, confused. "Sir, the challenge was never about breaking thunder," the Baron explained, his accented voice thick with emotion. "It was about finding someone who could understand him, someone who could show my workers and this town that there are different ways to approach the unknown." He paused, looking directly at her. "Thunder is yours, if you will have him. That was always the gift I intended." The gasps from the crowd were audible, but Aiyana barely heard them. "Mine. A magnificent creature deserves an equally magnificent partner," the Baron said simply. "You have shown us all something precious today. That understanding is more powerful than force, that respect achieves what violence cannot." He smiled. "Besides, I suspect Thunder made his own choice quite clear." Jake Morrison stepped forward, his hat in his hands and admiration clear in his green eyes. "Aiyana, what you did today, I've never seen anything like it. You didn't break him, you set him free." "We set each other free," she replied, understanding the truth of it as she spoke. Thunder was no longer a captive creature, and she was no longer a woman trapped between two worlds. They were both exactly what they had always been, wild, free, and unashamed of their true nature. As the crowd began to disperse, each person carrying a new understanding of what they had witnessed, Aiyana remained with Thunder in the corral. The Baron's gift had been more than just a horse. It had been the chance to reclaim herself, to show Redridge that Apache wisdom had value, and to prove that the best partnerships were built on respect rather than dominance. Sarah Mitchell approached the fence, her face glowing with pride and love. "Aiyana, dear, you were magnificent, absolutely magnificent." "Thank you, Mother," Aiyana replied, and this time the word carried no hesitation, no sense of divided loyalty. She was Sarah's daughter by choice and love, and she was Apache by blood and spirit. For the first time in 12 years, she understood that she didn't have to choose between them. Thunder nickered softly, reminding her of his presence, and Aiyana laughed, a sound as free and wild as the desert wind. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them as herself, Aiyana Mitchell, daughter of two worlds, rider of the untamable spirit that lived in both human and horse hearts. The Baron's gift had shocked them all indeed, but not in the way anyone had expected. The greatest gift wasn't Thunder's strength or speed. It was the reminder that understanding, not conquest, was the true mark of civilization.